for a brief moment, I was so encouraged. You know, Pete was an elder here for years and years and years, and though he's resigned, he is still an elder statesman in this congregation, and therefore when he said, I had an hour and a half to preach, my heart skipped a beat. And then he rescinded it immediately. So disappointed, so I guess I won't take an hour and a half of your time. I'll go ahead and get after it here and see if I can get through this lesson for you. It is so good to see everyone here this morning. I appreciate so much your attendance here. You're an encouragement to me. I know you are an encouragement to others here. And I know that some of you are here with aches and pains and not feeling 100%. And I appreciate your taking the time to be here anyway, because it's an encouragement to people here. Being together is a very wonderful thing, and being together here to worship God is a wonderful thing. In fact, all over the world this morning, all over America this morning, at least in this time zone, people are worshiping God. It is amazing that for a nation that's gone woke and goofy on a lot of scores, we still have quite a few folks that attend a worship assembly. Now, unfortunately, what is going on there in the worship assembly, how people worship in their assemblies, is a topic for another time, because it is as varied and variegated as there are people on the planet. People have chosen in many, many different ways to worship, and so it's amazing how people get their authority, or think they get their authority, for doing what they do and calling it good for God, when God is very specific about what He wants us to do and has given us through the record of the New Testament what we should do in order to worship Him. But I want to focus on one facet of that particular equation this morning, and that is just showing up. You know? It was not long ago within our lifetime where a great vast majority of Americans understood Sunday was the Lord's day, and it was a day, in fact, we used to have what was called blue laws. Many of you that are older can remember some of those, where everything shut down because this was a day when it was expected that you go to church. You go to a worship assembly. In fact, there's a cafe over in Gatesville who shuts down early on Saturday night. Didn't know this, but they do, because they are very family oriented. They want you to get ready Saturday night to attend the worship assembly on Sunday morning. I admire them very much. I'm going to go eat there and give them my money a lot because they got great chicken fried steaks. But anyway, the point being, we used to live in a nation where that was the bulk of the majority of it, but not so much anymore. And so I think this is a timely lesson to encourage us to just show up. We need to be in the assembly of the saints when the saints come together to worship God. Your presence is vital, and not just from the perspective, which we'll talk about momentarily, about encouraging each other, okay, which is our function and role in part when we come together, but for the safety of your own soul. And that's what I want to really focus on right now. The fact that when the saints meet, you should take out time in your day, whatever day that is that the saints meet, and we talk about it here as the first day of the week, and we're going to look into that in a moment. But you should take time out, and you should attend the worship assembly of the saints. Now, I realize the movement that has gone in our country with religion has a lot of folks believing that, and especially because, you know, people have rejected what they, and I've never understood this, correct me if I'm wrong, but they kind of rejected organized religion. What have they opted for? Disorganized religion? Well, looking at some of it, I would say, yeah, that's pretty much the case. It's a little bit disorganized, their religion. In fact, it's so disorganized that people have decided we don't even have to come together anymore. In fact, you will hear someone say on occasion, oh, I don't need to go to the assembly at some location. I can go out under a tree and I can worship God just fine. Now, of course, it's very shocking when I say, well, yes, you can. Because immediately they're surprised, they're expecting to get a fight, but the fight will come in a moment when I say, but when the saints meet, no, you cannot be right with God out under the tree and worshiping by yourself. And that's what our text is talking about. There is a direct command here given, and this ironic to me that this is written to Jewish people, Jewish Christians, individuals whose history is long with worship assemblies. As a matter of fact, we all have great many things to be thankful for, because our worship assembly is not like it was in the Old Testament. Have you ever read some of the stuff they had to do? All of the things that occurred and transpired during the worship of God in the Old Testament, the details to which they had to pay attention and be just right and do exactly as God had commanded. Not that that's changed, but the fact is, there were so much more details involved. In fact, it's interesting to note when you go all the way back to Leviticus, to chapter 10 and verses 1 and following, as God is setting up the religion for the Mosaic people, the Jewish people, the Israelites, He's setting it up. And when they didn't do it right, why, right there at the doors of the tabernacle, fire came out of heaven and totally consumed Nadab and Abihu. Why? They didn't do a specific thing God said to do. And so it just torched them right there on the spot. And of course the irony is that when the guys came in to get what was left of the bodies, the ashes, they picked them up with the cloaks that those two priests were wearing. So evidently the fire, in a miraculous way, torched them, didn't touch their clothing, and they carried them out. And God told Aaron, don't you grieve for your sons right now, because you're in a worship assembly of God, and you pay attention to what you're supposed to do with worship. God takes worship very seriously. That, if nothing else, in Leviticus 10, 1 and following, that teaches us that God takes worship very seriously. Well, I'll tell you what, when it came to the Jewish people knew what worship was, and they went to great lengths to do exactly what God said. In fact, the tradition got so thick and heavy surrounding their worship that the Pharisees would go in, and to be just exactly right, would tithe of mint and cumin, some little tiny small element that they would cut into 10 parts and give the 10th, just so they could tithe perfectly. That's how technical they were in that time. They knew about worship. So when Jesus came on the spot and began to teach them that the new covenant is going to be different, in John 4, if you look there, John 4 is explaining to a woman who has this perception about worship. You go to a specific place and you go through some things there in that place during a parameter of beginning and ending of time, and then when you leave, you're done there. And in part, she had it right, except that back in the day, they had specific places they were to go. And so when she was talking about things to Jesus, she said, you know, our folks think you're supposed to worship here or worship there. She perceived that he was a prophet. Look at verse 20. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain. You Jews say that in Jerusalem is the place to worship, and that went off to worship there. And he said, woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. Now, can't you imagine Jewish Christians over here in Hebrews going, all right, now we don't have to go any place or be in any one place to worship God. We could just go out there under the oak tree, or sycamore tree, I guess, for them, and you can worship God out there. And it would seem to me like this is one of the things that this Hebrew writer was telling these Jewish Christians. No, that's not quite right. You still need to go to some place. As a matter of fact, in verse 25, there is a statement made there, and this is a command in the negative. Forsake not the assembling of yourselves together, such as the manner of some is. And I didn't read it, I quote it, because I remember the King James instead of the New King James. But anyway, the same idea comes to mind. It's a command. Now, let's remove all doubt as we begin this study and understand something about attending the assemblies of the saints, okay? It's not a choice if you want to be right with God. And that's the bottom line. I'm not trying to make rules where there are none. I'm just reading to you what the text says. We are commanded by God not to forsake the assembly. If the church has an assembly, we're supposed to be there. And this one particularly is talking about an assembly that was common amongst the Christians of that day. As a matter of fact, it's ironic that if you look in Acts, the 20th chapter, we find an incident wherein Paul is traveling all over, and he's in a big hurry to get back to Jerusalem. But lo and behold, in Acts, the 20th chapter, he sails from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread in verse 6, and in 5 days, joined them at Troas, where he stayed 7 days. Okay, the trip took 5 days. He's going there, it took 5 days to get there. Now, he's in a hurry. He's got to get to Jerusalem before the Passover. He's got to get there. And yet, he waits 7 days. Now, why is this? Well, Well, I would assert that on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, that assembly was more important even than getting to Jerusalem on his journey. I've always used this verse when I talk to people about their travels. When you travel, it's a wonderful thing to travel and go see places, even if Barry said in class he doesn't like to travel anymore. That's his problem, right? Oh, there you go. But anyway, nevertheless, when you travel, you should look for places to worship, because on the first day of the week, you should take the time out not to forsake the assembly. It's important to God. We'll get to that in a minute. So Paul stayed there in Troas for quite some while so that he could assemble with the saints. Now, it is amazing with the technology today how one must define what an assembly is. It is amazing to me what passes as an assembly for worship assembly anymore. Not too long ago in our recent past, you remember the COVID, and you remember the mandates that came down from our government. Thou shalt not assemble together. And Christians said, we will. And so the question is it all right in civil disobedience to do that which the government has forbidden you to do? Well, if God said, don't forsake the assembly, I want you to know that God is ahead of the government, and God said, assemble, and I will assemble, as all of us should. Okay, but the question became, because of our great technology, and we have what's called streaming. Now, I'm getting into a category I am totally lost in. I'm not a techno guy. But I have been able, and it's a wonderful thing. My son is a preacher in South Africa, in Pretoria, or that region. And I get to talk to him 2-3 times a week. And it's interesting, our conversations, because there's a delay, because we're on the other opposite sides of the earth. But I can see his face clearly. I can see my little granddaughters, whom I will never be able to hug, but I can see them. And they can see me, and it's scary for them, but they can see me, and we joke and bug each other, and it's a blast. Isn't it wonderful, the technology we have these days? Why, when I was in the Navy in one of my first med crews, I called my wife and talked maybe a minute and a half, and it cost me $80. And I didn't even see her. Look at what we can do today. And so people have taken that technology and decided, oh, if we're not going to meet because of COVID or whatever, name your poison, we're going to just stream, and that will be our assembly. But wait a minute. Let's let God define assembly. Turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. I don't know how much more simple God could have put it, and I know it's simple because I can understand it, so it's not terribly complex. But here's your definition of assembly. Notice in chapter 11, and follow with me through the various verses. I'm just going to jump from one to the next. Start in verse 17. Now, in giving these instructions, Paul said to the Corinthians, whose worship assembly was totally messed up in so big a way, I do not praise you, since you come together not for the better but for the worse. They come together. That's an assembly. But let's be more specific in verse 18. But first of all, when you come together as a church, you know, you can't be an assembled church without coming together as a church. And further, in verse 20, therefore, when you come together in one place. I'm telling you for a fact, when I'm talking to my son over in South Africa, we are talking to each other, but we are not assembled. We are not assembled. This, my friends, is an assembly. We are all together as the church in one place. As a matter of fact, the conclusion of the chapter in verse 33, therefore, my brethren, when you come together to eat, he is referencing the Lord's Supper. That element of worship that is only authorized to be taken on the first day of the week, Acts 20 and 7. We just looked at that. So when you talk about an assembly, we need to allow God to define the assembly. And so he said, but if anyone is hungry, let him eat at home, because that's not the function of this assembly. Now later on we're going to eat, and we invite all of you to stay to eat with us. We would enjoy fellowship, but that's not the worship assembly. Because we don't need a common meal in the worship assembly. What we do is partake of the Lord's Supper like we just finished doing. That is the assembly. And that's how it's defined in the Bible. Now go back and since we've defined terms, let's go back and look at how God looks at our assembly here this morning. In the first place, he says, brethren, in verse 19, we should have boldness to enter the holy, it's the Holy of Holies, the holiest by the blood of Jesus. Do you know what that's referencing there? I've often said we lack in our intelligence and knowledge of the Old Testament. It really does cripple us when we get the New Testament, because so many things in a Hebrew letter where you're talking to Jews whose history and tradition have forever been wrapped up in the Mosaic covenant, they understood this easy. Sometimes for those of us who are Gentiles, it might be a little more difficult to understand. But yeah, he's talking about their worship to God. Why, that happened, in fact, in the holiest one time in the year. You want to talk about a special time of worship. One time. And they all get together, and the whole high priest goes into that one place, one time during that year. That is a special place. And you know what? I don't know whether we realize this or not like we should and appreciate it like we should, but every time we have an assembly, we are going into the holiest, the Holy of Holies. God has given us the privilege of being in His presence because of Christ's blood in ways the Jews could never appreciate, but only experience secondhand through the high priest who went into the Holy of Holies. None of the other people got to go in. And here we are, priests of God, and we are in communication with God. Folks, we are honored and privileged, and God has given us great blessing to assemble and approach His throne of glory. How can anyone look at that as something that's just become humdrum because we got to do it every first day of the week? Oh, quite the contrary. This is a great privilege for us to do. And so he goes on and talks about Christ, our high priest. And then he goes on and says, let's draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith. And then you go on further and he says, let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works. My friends, if you're not in the assembly, you can't stir me up to good works. You can't stir your brethren up to good works. You're not here. How can you possibly do that? And you know, I can just see some of the Jews so thrilled about not having to go to the temple and not having to go through all the procedures they had to go through and saying, oh, it's so great, I can go out to the sycamore now and worship God. Well, you can, but that's not the only time you do. And when you assemble with the saints on the first day of the week, if you forsake it, you sin. Now, how serious do you think God is with this? Because I've heard this text used in verse 26 and following that is all, a paradigm over all sin, which could be made, the case could be made for that. But in the context, what are we talking about? We're talking about worshiping God. We're talking about assembling like we are doing this morning. We're assembling. How important is that to God? Well, notice what he says in verse 26. If we sin willfully. What? How are we sinning willfully? Well, we're sinning willfully when we forsake the assembly. When you don't come to the assembly, it's not light fare. It's not no big deal. It's not a, oh, my bad. Absolutely not. You have failed to do what God has commanded you to do by forsaking the assembly. Now, we can get into what we do in the assembly. We can get into why it's important for us and important to God. But those are not really the point of my lesson this morning. My point is, if you read the context, when you don't assemble, you sin. Period. There's just no escape from that. Now, what happens when we sin willfully? Now, I want you to know, too, as a caveat, he does say, if we sin willfully. This is not something where we get a flat tire or run over a telephone post or a deer. I think someone ran over a deer recently. Those kinds of things slow you down. And that would be a reason why you don't make the assembly. God did not get all over John because he was exiled to the Isle of Patmos, because he didn't hop a skiff and run over to Samos and worship with the church over there. That was not there's nothing like that. When you can't make it, and I know we have our assembly sometimes, like the midweek service. We have it on Wednesday evening. It's at 7 o'clock. It's dark. If your eyes are bad and you struggle riding at night or driving at night, don't go out and kill yourself, wrap yourself around the deer, okay, to attend a Bible class. God understands that. But in the morning when we can all see, and the Sunday morning, which everybody likes to relax and just, take it easy and get ready for the football game, you have an obligation to meet on the first day of the week. And there is no reason you can't other than something that keeps you from it. We have several in our number this morning that are not here with us. I know would love to be here. I miss Ira. He's not here today. But he's not feeling good. His hips are bothering him, and he can't get up and get going. God does not condemn a man because he cannot make it. He did not condemn John. But who he would condemn is a guy like me who's got some knee problems, but not enough to keep me from standing up here and talking to y'all too long. So therefore, I got no excuse. As a matter of fact, what we're looking at is if I choose not to, I have chosen to sin against God. And so therefore, if we sin willfully after receiving the knowledge of the truth, let me tell you what God says you have to look forward to. Verse 27, a certain fearful expectation of judgment, and fiery indignation, which will devour the adversaries. Now I want you to say, he's putting an exclamation point on this for a Jewish Christian here because he references the Jewish law. And he goes, in the old law, somebody sinned. Well, let's see, at the testimony of two witnesses, they drug them out of town and threw rocks at them till they died. Now, how serious do you think it's going to be when judgment comes? And you've chosen not to assemble, had something else to do, more priorities on another platter, and then you get to judgment. We know him who said, vengeance is mine, I will repay. And again, the Lord will judge his people. And I'll tell you what, folks, if you're just skipping because you just don't want to be here, read verse 31 and let it sink in. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of a living God. If it is the case you are willfully not attending worship assemblies on Sunday morning, be afraid. Be very afraid. Be scared for your soul, because when you stand before the judgment, how are you going to tell Christ, your sacrifice for me was really not that important? Notice in verse 25, just backtracking a bit, those who do this, what will he be thought worthy as far as punishment? Who has trampled the Son of God underfoot. Can you see him in suffering, hanging on that cross for you? And it's just too hard for me to get here Sunday morning, There's a little fog out this morning, you know how it is. Counted the blood of the covenant by which he was sacrificed a common thing? Really? That new covenant that he died for so that we could be washed in blood and we could be saved? And we just can't make it Sunday morning, sorry. And insulted the Spirit of grace. Yeah, you insult God when you don't show up on a Sunday morning to serve God in the worship assembly when the church is assembled together to praise him, and we are to be here to encourage each other. Now, of course, I'm preaching to the choir, right? Because y'all are here. A lot of those who chose not to be here. How can we say, John would say in his epistle, how can we say we love our brother, we love God and hate our brother? If we love God, we're supposed to love our brethren. If we really, truly love our brethren and they are on a road making a beeline to the gates of Hades, and they're in trouble and they're looking to an eternity that God describes here as a fearful thing to fall into the hands of a living God, what might we say to them? What might we do for them to encourage them? You need to be there. And perhaps maybe we can invest in a time to explain to them how important it is to God that we be there. Because you see, it's not about numbers, okay? I like to see big numbers. I can't deny it. It's not about your contribution. It's nice to see a big contribution. It helps pay the bills, but it helps preacher students, and it helps spread the gospel. But that's not what really it's about. It's about you being here to encourage me and me to encourage you so that we go out and do what we are intended to do, and that is help somebody go to heaven. But if we don't help, they go straight to hell. That's what it's about. Now, how important is it to you to be here this morning? How important is it for you to help somebody who's not here, and you know who they are? We all know everybody. It's a small town. Who are you trying to help this morning be here? I would invite you to have patience. I would invite you to have perseverance. For as long as there's breath, there's life. And as long as there's life, there's a choice. You made the right choice this morning. You are to be commended. You are here with saints worshiping God. Great decision. Understand how valid, how important, how eternal that decision is that you made to come here this morning. The worship assembly is not to be taken lightly, as so many do. And it's not capable to substitute a stream on a computer, or a sycamore tree, or oak tree around these parts, or a mesquite tree. It's not, you can't substitute that for being here and provoking one another, encouraging one another to good works. I hope I've encouraged you to realize how important and how wonderful it is from God's perspective that you chose to be here this morning. You are to be commended. If you're not a Christian, we always offer an invitation in song. We want you to become a Christian. If you don't know how to work, talk to somebody. Somebody here would love to tell you how you get to heaven. If you are a Christian and not living right, and you need public help, we have two elders who would love to pray for you. We'll pray with them as they lead us in those prayers and try to help you get back where you need to be. But don't leave the building outside of God's grace. We invite you to the song we sing as we